and welcome to Congressman Huffman. He was elected to the Assembly in 2006 and to Congress in 2012, where he, as you know, is a recognized climate activist. And for us, he's a trusted port in the storm, and we count on him for providing balance and understanding and welcome to the world as it is today. We're going to deal with things the following way. We have outlined some set of questions that we're going to orchestrate for the congressman, Bill and I, and at the same time, we want you to put your questions into the chat. So I'm going to turn it over now to Bill with the first set of questions.
Yeah, good morning and welcome, Jared. It's great to be talking with you this morning. Many in our audience will probably remember the first event that Bell and I put together with you about 8 years ago, and the title of that was "What Would Climate Leadership Look Like in Washington?" And in 2022, I think we saw that. We really saw we had a very good year in terms of climate action on a national level. With the Inflation Reduction Act, of course, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and even more recently, the Omnibus Spending Act. So could you highlight the chief ways that these actions support national climate action? And especially how they support our climate efforts here in Marin, like EV adoption and building electrification, carbon sequestration.
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that, Bill and Bell and Bob. Thanks for the great introduction. And as we start this conversation, let me just say how much I appreciate all of you and MCL. You had some kind words about me on these climate and environmental issues. I will put it right back to you. On just about everything I work on, MCL is just an incredibly valuable resource and often an ally. So let me echo the pitch that was made for everybody to join MCL. And let me thank you for your just many, many years of great, thoughtful advocacy. So you're inviting me to start the conversation by celebrating some wins, and it's nice to be able to do that. This fight against the climate crisis can often be overwhelming. It can feel like we don't have enough wins, but you're absolutely right. In the last 2-year session of Congress, we did some big and I think transformative things. And so to just sort of summarize some of the biggest impacts that I'm pleased about. You have heard about the $360 billion in clean energy tax credits. These are kind of the core of the industrial policy shift that we're trying to make in the Inflation Reduction Act to really transform decarbonization in the transportation and industrial sectors and the power sectors to some degree. Those are maybe the biggest and most impactful things, but there's actually a lot more, a lot of direct investment. Things like $60 billion for clean energy manufacturing across the US and the whole supply chain of clean energy and transportation technologies. A lot of these changes are meant to not only support zero emission things that we need to make, but to really support workforce development and investment and, kind of achieve this clean energy economy that we've been talking about for so long. So that's why I often refer to this as industrial policy change. We've got $200 million in grants for states to develop and implement programs to train contractors to help folks get out there and install these energy efficient systems in homes and electrify our homes. $27 billion for grants and loans to support zero emission technologies, and $7 billion of that is going to be for state green banks. So I think you can imagine a lot of the good outcomes that can come from that. Many of you know that I have been fighting to electrify the largest civilian vehicle fleet in the world, the United States Postal Service. And it's been an uphill fight because a Trump appointee, who's Postmaster General, put out a big multi-billion-dollar contract for clunkers that would get 8 miles to the gallon, and that would be the new postal fleet, internal combustion clunkers. We put $3 billion into the Inflation Reduction Act to strongly incentivize the Postal Service. It's kind of hard to mandate the Postal Service because they have this autonomous status under federal law. But this was a pretty large carrot, and you may have heard a few weeks ago the Biden administration successfully persuaded Postmaster General DeJoy to change that contract so that most of those vehicles are now going to be EVs. I'm going to keep pushing to get us to the point where it's 100% EVs, but to be at 75% out the gate with the benefit of this funding is huge. And that's going to be a real game changer for electric fleet vehicles. We've got a bunch of money in the Inflation Reduction Act for forest resiliency, a couple $2 billion for hazardous fuel reduction, vegetation management, inventorying old growth forests. Those of you who care about the coasts and the ocean will be pleased that there's $2.6 billion for NOAA to fund conservation, restoration, and other coastal resiliency initiatives. And then going back to the prior year, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, there's just a lot in there that we can feel really good about as well. Some bad stuff that we'll have to manage, but the largest federal investment in public transit in history, lots of money for passenger and freight rail, stuff for bike infrastructure and recreational trails, safe routes to schools. You are familiar, I think, with the investments in a national EV charging network, but there's also a chunk of money available for local communities to get EV charging infrastructure out into every part of our communities. And then a lot of money for water. I actually wrote a lot of the water provisions. And this is not big controversial dams. This is actually the cost-effective, truly resilient water infrastructure that we need throughout the West, especially in California. And then $62 billion for investments that relate to the grid. And modernizing the grid is just going to be very, very important to all of the decarbonization work that we need to do. Lastly, you asked about the omnibus. We did get some big wins in the government spending bill, and some of them are very local. So I was able to get $2 million for EV charging expansion in San Rafael, $791,000 for EV infrastructure and equity in Nevada, $650,000 for new energy efficient lighting at Golden Gate Village in Marin City, and then 1.8 million that is going to be critical for the design and planning of the SMART extension over the Russian River Bridge into Healdsburg. I continue to work to try to realize that original promise of getting SMART all the way up to Cloverdale. So those are just a few high points, and there's a lot, absolutely a lot to celebrate. I'll just close out my answer to that question, Bill, by saying if sometimes you don't hear me spiking the football and celebrating as much as I probably should, because these are big wins, it's because we've still got a lot of work to do. And that's the tricky part of this whole climate crisis. People politically, emotionally really crave these mission accomplished moments. And the reality is we're just not going to have one of those in the climate crisis. And we got to find a way to stay motivated and keep working really hard, even without that.
Okay, thank you very much. And Bell has a follow-up question, I think, on this topic.
What is the role of the White House and the states in implementing these acts that you just talked about? Because we're beginning to hear more about that, and we just wondered if you could enlighten us.
Sure. Well, the White House has a lot of work to do. They've got to stand up entirely new programs in many cases. And, those are going to come through Pete Buttigieg in the Department of Transportation. They're going to come through the Secretary of Energy in some cases. They're going to come through a whole bunch of federal agencies. And we're going to have to make sure that they do it right and that they do it quickly. We want this money to get out the door. But the states will have an important role too. And when you look at the transportation infrastructure, for example, Caltrans is going to have a huge role in spending the money that comes down to California. And a lot of the funding that you see in the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be for things that some states aren't going to want to do. I mean, it's pretty hard to imagine Texas and Florida doing a green bank, right? But California will. And so we're going to have great opportunities to, compete even better than many other states for a lot of this funding. But we're going to have to keep an eye on our state agencies to make sure that they're doing the right thing, that they're not taking these funds and trying to use it to backfill for, probably what is a coming deficit in California. We go from boom to bust with our state budget cycles. And I don't want to see this funding, backfilling normal state budgetary obligations. I want to see it going exactly for the things that we intended when we passed it. So I think all of us will need to keep a close eye on that.
Good, thanks.
And Bill, you want to follow up with the next topic?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, there was one question that came up that I thought you might want to comment on, is why is DeJoy still there?
Yeah, because DeJoy is can only be fired really by the Postal Governing Board. And we have not been able to confirm enough Biden appointees to have a political majority yet. I think we're nearing the point where we can, but I think DeJoy is smart enough to sort of, count to a majority on his board, and he's begun to moderate his original position on things like this. He actually has also done a few good things in terms of stabilizing the financing of the Postal Service. So I don't know if he'll survive or not. I don't like him. I would have gotten rid of him a long time ago, but we just don't have that power, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me introduce the second batch of questions that we're interested in. Is the prospects for continuing congressional climate action in 23 as control of the House has changed hands. And, sort of what new climate laws or funding are possible. And so this is a big one, and you're coping with it is another one. So Philip, we'd like to hear you on that set of issues.
Yeah, I hope everybody enjoyed episode 1 of Republican Chaos a couple of weeks ago. You're going to see a full season of this, so get ready. What it means for climate policy. So you asked about new laws and also the broader set of things we need to do. I don't think anyone should hold their breath for, big, impactful climate action by way of legislation. It's going to be hard to do that. That's just the reality. That probably would have been the case with a narrow Democratic majority too, because we may have squeezed about as much good stuff out of Joe Manchin as we are capable of getting. So I think the focus is probably going to have to be on implementation and just making sure that we are delivering, that we are getting this money out the door, that it's being spent in the ways that we intended, and that we're protecting the Biden administration from obstruction, which we are definitely going to see. That obstruction will certainly come from this new House Republican majority. They've made no secret of that. But it's also going to come from Joe Manchin. He was furious that the White House is trying to kind of tinker with some of these EV supply chain and manufacturing standards that Manchin put into the Inflation Reduction Act. The White House is doing that because they want to give the EV industry a chance to succeed. And I think Manchin may have had different intentions with some of these really rigorous standards that he put in place. In some ways, I think he wanted to embarrass EV manufacturers by setting really fast, almost immediate sourcing standards that nobody could meet. So we'll be pushing back on Manchin as well when he tries to slow things down or gum things up. And I'm sure that we're going to see some of that.
And is there a strategy also for protecting all the good gains that were accomplished this year?
Well, yeah, that's what it's all about. Through so-called oversight, Republicans are going to try to obstruct and embarrass and do what they do. And our job will be to defend. Absolutely. And to avoid these hostage situations, we're going to see the first one with the debt ceiling coming up here in the next few weeks. And it looks like they're pretty focused on, budget cuts as the terms that they will demand for raising the debt ceiling. We'll see if we can navigate around that without giving away more concessions. I think we can, but we're going to see that kind of hostage taking at every possible juncture in the next year and a half. And we just got to make sure that clean energy and climate actions that we've achieved are not given away in those moments.
Okay.
Well,
So jumping to the third thing that we wanted to make sure to cover, and then we'll get into the chat questions. You were part of the U.S. congressional delegation to the UN's COP27 climate summit in November, not very long ago, which seemed to witness widespread global backsliding on greenhouse gas goals. So what were your chief takeaways from the summit, and how do we meet those goals in the limited time that we have left?
Yeah, there certainly was backsliding in the sense that we did not move forward on these national commitments that need to become much more specific and much more rigorous. There was a little bit of progress on the so-called loss and damage issue, which is going to be really important to bringing developing countries along. But I would agree, it wasn't a hugely successful summit. And when you have these conferences in a place like Egypt, a fossil fuel nation for the most part, and they present, Egypt gets to choose the president of the COP. The host country does that. It's going to be really tough to make it as bold and transformative as it needs to be. And next year, it's going to be even worse because it's at the United Arab Emirates. And they have just appointed their COP president, who is an executive of their national oil company. So I am not happy at all about that. In fact, I just finished a letter to our climate envoy, John Kerry, asking him to get engaged and either find a new president of COP28 or work with the UN to find a different host country, because I think this is absolute BS that we allow this to happen. So stay tuned on that, but you're not wrong in your characterization.
there's a protest going on in Davos about this right now. And I think that and John Kerry has spoken up, taking the position, and it's a reasonable one. This guy is really good, and that he might have more influence on the oil petro states than anybody, because he's somebody you can count on. So there you are with the answer that they have.
Yeah, I don't like that answer.
Yeah. Okay. And just one more thing on this. How do you think we can get up more funding to assist these other countries in coping with climate impacts? Because what we promised and what we are committing are really different.
Yeah, it's going to be really hard for us to appropriate that funding in the United States, just given our politics. Republicans are going to oppose direct funding of the Green Climate Fund every single time. And so we're going to have to find other ways to do it. And I think these international financial institutions are the answer.
Yeah.
The terms in which they make financing available to these countries for clean energy projects are way too restrictive, and they're way too lenient for fossil fuel projects. And so the outcome is, and I talked to developers who want to do solar and wind in Africa and other emerging economies, and they can't get access to these national development banks the way that their fossil fuel competitors can. So I think if we can change that, it is a way of moving money into these countries to help them decarbonize and also develop economically. And that ought to count toward our basically towards our loss and damage contribution. I believe that'll probably be a big part of it.
Thanks.
Okay, we have a couple of questions coming in, several from the chat, and I would encourage folks to keep sending those in. One is, what might be possible to control the increasing use of fossil fuels in producing single-use plastic? I think this is something you've paid some attention to.
Yeah, I've been working with Cory Booker on a bill to try to go upstream and set much more rigorous standards for these so-called chemical recycling plants, which is a joke. I mean, you're going to hear a lot of this from the fossil fuel industry, that there's sort of new technology for pyrolysis and gasification that is a great way to recycle plastic. And so you don't have to worry about all the plastic that is proliferating in our lives. It's not real, and it's really polluting, and it has terrible public health effects. And so I think we should continue to be deeply skeptical of all forms of plastic recycling, and we need to focus on just reducing the amount of plastic we have in our lives and in our economy. So California's done some really good things, some great bills, I think, being talked about even in this state legislative session. We've got to do a lot more at the federal level. This bill I'm doing with Senator Booker includes a lot of things that the EPA could do on its own right now, setting standards, cracking down on the polluting effects of these facilities. So those are the things that I'm pushing on. And I think there's room for all of us to get engaged on this. We're going to need to, because as we continue to decarbonize the power sector and the transportation sector, this is the next big thing where fossil fuel is going to try to keep us hooked on their product. They're going to just be pushing a lot of plastic at us, and we need to get ahead of it.
Okay, and another question that's, the EU will soon begin the first phase of implementation of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and to put their carbon price on carbon intensive imports. And should the US be part of the emerging G7 climate club that have a comparable US border adjustment and carbon price?
Yes. And I encourage I talk to my friends who are parliamentarians in Germany and the EU now and then, and I always urge them to do this. By them setting that carbon border adjustment, it puts a lot of pressure on us to do the same, and it's sort of a backdoor way to get the kind of carbon pricing that we need, or at least the beginning of carbon pricing.
Great.
We also have a detailed question here. It says, as a realtor, I'm trying to stay informed about all the new rebates and incentives for homeowners to make environmentally beneficial upgrades. Where can I find a comprehensive list of all the federal incentives and rebates now available?
Yeah, I think the White House just put something out that gives us that. So I don't know, Jenny Calloway from my office is on this Zoom. I don't know if we have that posted, or if you might have access to the link that we could share, but the incentives are really great. And I mean, I will just tell you right now, I am in the process of doing a heat pump in my house, and the incentive is really compelling. It's a great time to do it. It's a great time to get rid of that natural gas stove and to get an induction cooktop or something like that. And there's, you know, several $100s worth of incentives there available. That's just at the federal level. So it's worth checking out and maybe circulating it to the MCL community so that everybody's aware.
Yeah, and I just want to add how important these incentives are to put some backbone in our local councils and supervisors in passing ordinances here that actually require this transition. But to have these incentives to back it up is just really makes all the difference. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Senator, we have one more question on this that perhaps you can comment on. Senator Whitehouse has expressed impatience with the Biden administration or apparent lack of aggressiveness on climate. What do you think, and how could they do better?
Well, we all need to always be impatient. So I'm never very critical of Sheldon Whitehouse or anyone else for being impatient. Um, I remember having a conversation with Sheldon about that a few months ago, and I don't know if he still feels that way. But there's a bunch of big rulemakings that have been kind of dragging on, from methane to various power plant standards and workarounds to address the terrible Supreme Court ruling that we got in the last term. I think he's probably talking about that, and we do need the administration to move faster in its rulemakings. We've got another year and a half of this administration, and what you don't want to see is for them to bring all of these new regulations over the finish line in the final days of the administration, because there's this thing called the Congressional Review Act that the next Congress could do within 90 days of a final rule to basically undo those regulations. And we need to beat the clock. We need to be at least more than 90 days ahead of the end of the administration with these key regulations.
Good.
And we have a particular question relating to the National Park Service, and apparently millions have been made available recently to beef up their staffing. And the question is, are there any guidelines of how that's going to be tracked and paid and tracked?
I'm not familiar at that level of detail with the Park Service staffing issue and funding, but we'll be interested in it, and I'm happy to look more into it.
Okay, more MCL research here. Great. Let's see. Are there Rewiring America and Building a Decarbonized Coalition? Whoops, sorry, missed that. What are the changes of permitting reform? Sorry. Particularly for necessary transmission infrastructure as we electrify everything. How do we get that grid up to snuff?
Yeah, I'm glad that that question was asked, because this was the other piece of the Joe Manchin deal that Chuck Schumer forged, and it's a piece that I don't support. Joe Manchin as basically a condition for him going along with all these good clean energy investments in the Inflation Reduction Act, demanded separate legislation that would change the NEPA standard for disadvantaged communities and others to engage on projects that affect them. It would hardwire prioritization of a bunch of large projects that have to include fossil fuel projects every single year. It would basically be a presidential stamp of support on the Mountain Valley Pipeline and any number of other large fossil fuel projects every single year. It would roll back Clean Water Act provisions that give states and tribes a special role in approving large infrastructure projects, energy infrastructure projects. And I think it's just bad policy. I'm all for speeding the improvement of our electrical grid, but you don't have to do all these lousy things, and you don't have to put a thumb on the scale for fossil fuel in order to meet our goals for the grid. A lot of them can be met by FERC. They are in the process of some rulemakings. And if we could confirm the chair of FERC, which Joe Manchin is withholding his support for, we would have a governing majority that could move, with some urgency on that issue. But that's one way to do it. The other is just use the tools we've got. We put $1 billion into the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act for this very issue, to support the streamlining and the expediting of clean energy infrastructure. Give it a chance to work. President Biden passed an executive order calling on all of his federal agencies to coordinate and form a task force to streamline the permitting of clean energy projects. So you've got all of these new things that we're beginning to do to make these projects move faster, and none of it has had a chance to actually work. But Joe Manchin wants to do a lot of damage in the name of streamlining on permitting reform. So you should look very skeptically at these proposals, and I think look very carefully at the things we are doing to speed up and streamline the permitting of clean energy. I think we can get there.
And a good question is, what can we do to incentivize public transportation as we switch to EVs? Many customers cannot afford the charge at home. Have you got some thoughts on that?
You know, that's going to involve a lot of local folks and transit operators. They've got to pay their bills and keep the lights on. But I think we should try to make public transportation as close to free as possible in every instance. And we got a long way to go there. I know that SMART at various times has talked about that. You know, they don't get a huge amount of money at the fare box anyway. And they're going to need broad public support to re-up the sales tax here in the next few years. So making that as close to free as possible would be a great way to increase ridership and get the broad public support that they need. Plus, I think it's just good incentives and good policy.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing a chat question that's close to my heart. What do we need to know about the Farm Bill? And my augmentation of that would be, you know, this is a bill that's being reauthorized this year, and is agriculture an area where bipartisan action benefiting climate might be possible? And in particular, having to do, is there anything in the Farm Bill that might be supportive of carbon sequestration in soils?
Yes, the answer is yes. And we do have a few of these programs, mostly overseen by the NRCS, that, you know, at a very small, almost pilot scale, are supporting soil health and good practices that we know can be climate solutions. We've got to find ways to scale that up and to embed greenhouse gas reduction and soil health in a whole bunch of programs. So the EQIP program, there's a stewardship program in the Farm Bill where lots of money is pushed out through RCDs and other local partners. All of that should have climate measures built in to the programs as components. And it shouldn't just be this little boutique, you know, pilot thing that we tinker around with. We've got to embed it and we've got to scale it. And I've been part of a group in Congress that has come up with recommendations for the Farm Bill that would do that. So let's keep an eye on that. But I think scale is going to be the thing that we need to focus on, and not just these little, you know, tinkering kind of grants and pilot projects that we've done in the past.
And
So
you're uniquely positioned as someone who represents both urbanized regions and also a large rural region to address these issues. So thank you.
Well,
for that.
and I've got a lot of good pioneering agricultural leaders in my district too. So, you know, Albert Strauss is out there feeding seaweed to his cows, and we've got all kinds of people doing cutting edge things outside the box to sequester carbon in the soil and build biodiversity and other things. So I benefit from learning a lot about this, you know, from right here in Marin.
So one question that is more general is, how can the Republicans screw up IRA implementation, and what can the Democrats do about it?
Well, I'm sure that they're in their evil laboratory thinking of ways to do just that right now. So, look, they're gonna try to defund a lot of these things every year in the budget process. They're gonna threaten government shutdowns. They're gonna, you know, we know what's coming because I've been in the minority and I know what they try to do every single time. And they're going to try to embarrass the Biden administration. They love doing that. So that's why I think it's super important that as these programs roll out, that they're done really well. We need this to be successful. But if we do that, you know, I don't know that there's a lot they can do to stop it, Bill. And, you know, I'll give you a great example of that. These industrial policy changes that I was describing a little while ago, are resulting in a huge solar manufacturing project coming to Deep Red, Georgia, in the district of none other than Marjorie Taylor Greene, or Perjury Trader Queen, as we call her. But lo and behold, even Marjorie Taylor Greene is a smart enough politician to realize that this is a whole bunch of jobs coming into her district, and she supports it. So that's the benefit of some of these things that we have set in motion, is that they're going to start producing really good jobs in all sorts of interesting places, and they have the potential to begin to change some of the politics of clean energy.
So speaking of obstructionism and its relation to economic reality, we have a question here. How do you think the debt limit will play out, including the final outcome?
Yeah, well, I know how I would like it to play out, and it goes like this. Instead of using, this cliff a few weeks down the road from now as a wedge to force us to reopen the government funding deal, that the bipartisan omnibus bill that should fund the government all the way through the end of September, I would argue that we've already passed a bipartisan government funding bill. I mean, it included a lot of stuff I didn't like. It was bipartisan. And so instead of reopening that and renegotiating that, I think we should reach out to the sensible Republicans who don't want to see the disruption of a debt ceiling crisis, and do what we call a discharge petition, where if you get 218 signatures on a discharge petition, it goes straight to the floor for a vote. It doesn't, Kevin McCarthy and his Freedom Caucus people that he's empowered can't stop it. And so I'm hoping we do a discharge position and just be done with this issue and prevent it from being a hostage situation.
So on the subject of sort of coastal matters here in California, I mean, in your district, what stricter rules are possible on plastic production and petrochemical plants? You have, you're proposing an act or a bill together, as you mentioned, with Cory Booker, or that you're thinking it through. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this is basically about the fact that these plants are, highly polluting. They tend to be located in communities of color, and that's just the legacy of this. And so we need to crack down on the standards for both continuing to operate plants like that, but also for siting and permitting them going forward. And that's what our bill's all about.
That's great. Yeah.
So speaking of impacts on disadvantaged communities, that's one of the questions here. What's being done to fund electrification and renewables in disadvantaged communities, particularly through the IRA?
Right. So you've probably heard about President Biden's EJ40 policy. He did this by executive order, and it requires that 40% of our investments in these initiatives go to historically disadvantaged communities. That is beginning to happen in some really great ways. I mean, I've gotten huge grants for all sorts of things, from broadband to solar energy, for some of the tribes I represent. And we've never seen anything like this. It's basically embedding environmental justice at the front end of all of these initiatives in a way we've never done before. And it's I think, going to be an ongoing framework that will do a lot to correct these historic injustices. So it pretty much applies to everything the federal government does. I mean, we're out there looking for ways to get EV charging money into Marin County. And, we have to think about disadvantaged communities and not putting EV chargers in Ross. It gets a little bit tricky because we have such good air quality in Marin County that even when you might have a disadvantaged community like Marin City or the Canal, and we're kind of running into this now with a grant that we're trying to put together with Cool the Earth. Our air quality is so good that we may not qualify for some of the measures that they may require under EJ 40. So we're going to keep trying for creative ways to make sure that our disadvantaged communities here in Marin benefit from this initiative as well.
One question that is of interest to people here is what chance does the Recovery Wildfire Act have of passing?
We're going to have to continue pushing forest resiliency and vegetation management, and these are things that I think there'll be bipartisan support for. I don't know if that bill in its current form, will pass in this Congress, but there are things we can do in the appropriation bills and other legislation, even with Republicans on that issue, because their districts are very, very vulnerable to this.
And another international question. There have been rumblings in the EU, Macron in France and others, that the IRA's domestic content mandates might run afoul. And I just lost the question. Where did it go?
I think I get it.
Yeah,
Industrial policy, yeah.
of trade laws. Yeah.
We've heard this from Macron, and we're going to hear this from others in Europe. And I just met with some German parliamentarians who were expressing concern about this. So the Biden administration has signaled that it is open to some fine tuning of some of these policies to make sure that, along with our European allies, we're all moving together on decarbonization and industrial policy. I think that's important. But it's also, in some ways, working, because the EU itself is looking at kind of their own version of the Inflation Reduction Act and big transformative incentives to drive clean energy industries there, and that's setting off kind of the righteous competition that we want to see. We should do it cooperatively with the EU because they're our ally, and in some ways, they have even better goals than we do on decarbonization. But I think we can get there. I think we will get there.
So back on a local issue, it's and big one too. What barriers need to be addressed for offshore wind energy? This is paramount here. Yeah.
Well, it is, and I've got one of the best and biggest projects just off the coast of Humboldt County that is moving forward. I just met with one of the two developers that was successful in the auction in December, and this is a big deal, and I'm excited about it, but it is complicated, and we got to get it right. So I think one of the most important things is community benefit agreements. The auction had a set aside. This particular developer is going to have to allocate about $8.5 million to various types of community benefits, and this ranges from like the fishing community that could be impacted by, in some cases, the loss of access to fishing grounds, and there's probably some other impacts. It includes tribes, it includes other community groups that will see some benefits up front just from the proceeds of the auction, and they're in negotiations right now to come up with that package. But in an ongoing way, there should be all sorts of community benefits, workforce, partnerships of various kinds. And it's going to be, I think, a real good news story for Humboldt County. You guys probably know that the economy up there, never really recovered to the heyday of timber extraction when things were really booming unsustainably. And this is about the best thing to come along in a long time. There's a company called Crowley Maritime that is literally investing over $100 million to modernize the port of Humboldt, not just for those floating wind platforms that are going to go out there in the next decade, but to manufacture the floating wind technologies that'll be used up and down the West Coast. The port of Humboldt is uniquely suited for that because it doesn't have any bridge at the opening of the harbor, and these turbines are like 10 stories tall. They're incredibly big, and they can't go out under the bridges of most ports. Humboldt is perfectly suited to do that. So we think that they'll be manufacturing these massive floating wind turbines right in Humboldt Bay for servicing Morro Bay, for servicing Southern Oregon. And that is just going to be a massive economic driver to Humboldt County. So people are pretty excited about it, but lots of mitigation and other details that'll have to be worked out.
There's a question that we have, which is, so how can we utilize all this power without damaging wildlife in the ocean, without transmission lines damaging the upland habitat?
Yeah, we are going to have to improve transmission in order for this to happen. And we've got about 10 years to bring that new transmission online, because that's about how long it's going to take to make power from these first lease sales. They haven't yet figured out exactly where the new transmission needs to go. There are some theories that we should do an ocean based along the ocean floor transmission that would take that electricity down to the Bay Area and beyond. Others think we just tie in right in Humboldt County and just upgrade that system, which we need to do anyway because it's really inadequate. So, all that's going to get worked out, but I am confident that we can build that transmission without major compromises to our environment. They've done this in a lot of places in Europe, slightly different offshore wind technology in the East Coast of the United States, but a lot of studies have happened, and people who worry about whether this will disrupt the Dungeness crab migration and all sorts of other things. We've got a fair amount of data already on that, but we'll be careful as we go forward and make sure it's done right. One of the encouraging things that we've seen in some of the floating wind deployments in Europe is that, yes, you do restrict some fishing access because these massive platforms are tethered together with steel cables that you don't want trawlers, for example, to get tangled up in. But the benefit that you have is that the fish populations tend to rebuild in those areas and spill over into surrounding areas. It's a little bit like a marine protected area, and those spillover effects, the abundance that you see in those areas, can actually be quite good for fishing in surrounding areas. So we just need to be thoughtful and engage the fishing community and the resource agencies on the front end. And I'm pretty confident that we're going to be able to do that.
So Jenny's telling us we need to think about wrapping up, but a couple of more questions from the chat. As an individual, where's the biggest bang for the buck in making an impact on climate change?
Buy an electric car, get a heat pump, get rid of your natural gas appliances, just do all that now.
Okay, a whole menu there.
There's one I think that we should, that's a local one, which is, can you give an estimate as to when the Klamath Dam removal project will be complete? And the person asks, thanks for your hard work on this.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So we're going to start taking down dams in a matter of actual weeks. I was on the ground with the Secretary of Interior and the governors of California and Oregon last month, and we're no longer talking about this as some sort of off in the future thing. Literally, the construction firm is mobilizing at the Iron Gate Dam to begin taking that thing down. So it'll be phases. We've got 4 major dams that are going to come down, and it'll take a few years, but the first of them is going to come down this year. So that's kind of exciting.
Very.
It's kind of a similar and very local one. Any estimates of timing on Route 37 improvements, and what is the best solution up there, and how would what can we do to achieve it?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And this is sort of the bad news part of Caltrans being responsible for spending all of this wonderful new federal money that we're passing down. Caltrans doesn't do resilience real resilience very well. It's new to them. They widen freeways. And that's what they're trying to do right now on Highway 37 in a real frustrating way. The good news there is that because we have gotten engaged, and many of you have gotten engaged, the Marin County segment of Highway 37 is finally getting talked about as a chance for an elevated causeway. And I think we may be on track to make that happen. And that's what we need. The short answer to your question, what's the solution? It's an elevated causeway. Ideally, a causeway that facilitates wetland restoration, that is multimodal, and will be truly resilient. So the Marin County segment, which is the part that was underwater last week, where Novato Creek does its flooding, may be on track for some kind of a causeway, and that's good news. Unfortunately, the part that they wanted to build now, so the first piece of the Highway 37 fix to go forward is the part from Sears Point to Mare Island, and they're just proposing a widened, hardened freeway in the existing roadway. It's a really bad project, and unfortunately, I've done everything I can to get them turned around to try to make this causeway ready and elevate it and support the full restoration of that incredibly large wetland complex, and we're just not getting there. So I think Caltrans any day now is going to finalize an EIR that is for a widened, hardened freeway. They call it an interim project, but this is going to be a permanent fixture if they're allowed to build it, and it's going to prevent us from building the causeway that we need and deserve. So it's worth staying engaged on that. And what we might be able to do, even though they're going to move forward with an EIR, is we can force design changes as they go forward. So that's going to be where I focus my efforts, and I really hope MCL stays engaged on that.
And as we come to an end, could you give us some ideas about how we can support you in your efforts to deal with the current congressional situation?
Oh gosh, thank you for that. Well, you know, I just need opportunities to vent now and then. So thank you for that. Thank you for the incredibly good policy work you do, for giving me a chance to hear your good ideas through forums like this. I can't even count the number of dialogues like this that we've done together with you, Belle, and Bill, and all of you. So that's really wonderful. It's a great chance for me to just maintain a two-way conversation with great environmental leaders in my district. Just keep being you. I appreciate it a lot.
So thanks very much. I mean, it's so impressive to hear the range of detail that you're able to finesse. I really appreciate that. And I also appreciate all the good questions that came in to give you a chance to demonstrate that ability. That was great. So thanks so much for making time available and engaging with us.
Really appreciate it. Hope we can do it again.